Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance.
So, hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Now, I'm very pleased to announce we have a return guest. He obviously couldn't get enough in the first instance. So, we have back with us Clive Webb from the ACCA to talk about another great piece of research. And I will say, Clive, there's a few others lined up. There's so many pieces of research that you guys produce. So the last session, for those that haven't listened to it, was all about how the role of finance is changing and some of the drivers and what's been happening through the pandemic and how that's impacted finance. But actually today we're going to focus very much on the CFO role itself and understand the research that Clive and the team did to understand all, from both perspectives, from the report when I read it, about what CEOs and businesses want from a CFO, as well as the CFO's perception of how their role is changing. So without further ado, I'm going to sort of hand over to you, Clive. So tell us a little bit about the research. How did you actually approach it?
Okay, so this was a joint piece of research that we did with IMA, the Institute of Management Accountants, and we did two things. We surveyed just over 1,000 ACCA members, IMA members, but crucially also non-members that were CFOs and CEOs across the globe. And we also did a number of virtual roundtables and interviews to support that. Add the two together, you get the sort of output of the research.
Brilliant. And so what are some of the key insights that came out of the research?
That's interesting. Um, I think let's start with the role of the CFO, and I think probably the objective of and the reason for having this conversation, the role of the CFO is changing, and I think we perhaps focus on something you and I mentioned in the last podcast that we did, Hannah, about the distinction between the CFO role and a finance director role, and the CFO role being very much strategic. And I think what we're increasingly seeing and what the survey data showed and the pandemic has highlighted very importantly, I think, is the CFO role is far more strategic. It's far broader than purely finance and custodial. That's not to say those parts aren't important, but it is a far broader definition of what is required. And you referred in your introduction to the various lenses we tried to look at this through. So we tried to sort of see the CFO lens and what CFOs think of other CFOs and what their expectations are, um, what they think the expectations of a CEO are. Obviously, we had some CEO data as well, and then what the external stakeholders think and investors think. And you get, at that point, even, you get slight differences. So, CEO is very much driven by insight, analysis, forward thinking role of a CFO. The perception of the public is ethics trumps everything and that ethical value. And that probably goes with reputation and safe pair of hands, I suppose. Investors, it's insights, it's mergers and acquisitions. Other CFOs, you get to accounting experience. Oh, and insight as well. So all of them coalesce around this thought of insight and the forward looking view, but not majoring really around purely accounting expertise. So I think the accounting part, absolutely fundamental, but to some extent a little bit of a given. The bit that is the strategic bit, and we can break that strategic bit down a bit more, is the fundamental thing and what's really expected. There then is a perception gap between what a CEO wants and what a CFO thinks they want. And I think the CEO is far more looking for something that is more strategic advice, if you like, the ultimate finance business partner, somebody that can act as their right hand or their confidant, bring a different skill set. But I think those organizations that have survived best in the pandemic have had CFOs who have been willing to counsel and advise and critique the actions of the CEO. So you see this balance. Um, maybe I'll stop there. There's a summary for you.
No, there's some really great things I just want to pick out, and I find your insight into the fact that there's a difference in perception between the CFO and what the CFO thinks the CEO wants and what the CEO wants from the CFO. So where do you think that gap has come from, and was there any interesting insights, as in any particular areas that CFOs aren't focusing on that they need to?
I think the gap in part is historic, and rather interestingly, I think part of that gap is geographic, and this was something that struck us quite firmly in the research. If you look at the CFO role in Asia, in South Asia, it is far more strategic. If you talk to CFOs in Western Europe, particularly the UK and the Irish Republic, it's a very traditional view. And I think that's partly where the gap is coming from, that the CEOs have a broader global lens and are wanting more advice. The card, perhaps of some finance directors and some CFOs, is far more traditional in what they're willing to offer. And as we talked in the previous podcast, if finance is going through a step change, obviously a CFO has to go through that step change too, because that's what is required of them. So I think in part that's that gap. And it's a question of believing that you've got the capability to do it and the space and the time, as well as the fundamental skills that are inherent in it.
It sounds like it's almost that not, I won't say reluctance, but that they're not quite shifting up into that CFO role. They're still sort of almost hovering more into that FD role versus the actual CFO role. Whereas actually what like you say, what the CEO is after is that very strategically focused piece.
We asked one pointed question. We had 6 hypotheses in the research. And our last hypothesis was, where's the career step for the CFO? Is it to the CEO role? And in Asia, absolutely bang on. In Europe, oh no, doesn't quite fit. We're not salespeople in the way that the CEO might be. So I think there's also a difference to some extent here in the CEOs as well as CFOs, that CEOs perhaps again are more traditional in Europe and perceived as more sales focused, whereas actually they're becoming far more operational focused as well. And it's that dual role, that partnership between the effective CEO and the effective CFO that I think is absolutely fundamental to future organizational success.
Yeah, and it was quite interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a stat about the percentage of people that thought that accounting qualifications were absolutely were not critical. And I found that fascinating. Was it 27%, I believe, when I was reading the research, didn't actually think that the accounting qualifications were essential. Not that it wasn't nice and useful, but that it wasn't essential, which I found fascinating.
And I think in part that goes to what is the CFO role, and in the research you'll see we sort of break out this funny sort of diagram which has these attributes or these elements of the role. And yes, at the core of it is that financial acumen, but it's also about strategic direction and innovation. It's about managing risk. It's about technology and data. It's about leading an organization, leading a team. It's about managing supply chains. That's become even more into the fore in recent months since we did the research. It's about managing investors. It's about being the ultimate business consultant. It's about knowing transactions, mergers, acquisitions inside out and getting value from them. That's a big role. But that's sort of what's expected in some form or other. Not every CFO needs to do all of those because it depends on the organization they're working with. But elements of all of those become highly relevant, and it is a very broad set of expertise. And I think that's part of the challenge, and particularly as you step away from large organizations into the middle tier, you find a cadre of people who have roles of virtual CFOs who are the people driving that expertise set on a part-time basis. And there's a very active market for that skill set for the middle tier. And I think that demonstrates what that CFO expectation is now. It's not simply keeping the books and records, the stewardship, etc. It is, what are the financial implications of this? What are the sustainability implications of this? Where do we go strategically? And particularly as a lot of mid-tiers and some of the virtual CFOs we talk to are backed by private equity houses, then you've got the dimension of, well, actually, where do we get the earn out to? And how do we get to the point that the investor wants to release their capital? And where do we go next? Those are fundamental elements of the CFO role going forwards. And it is a very complicated thing. So the question then becomes, how do you grow people into that generation? Because we need the next set of CFOs. And that in itself is quite a challenge.
Yeah, because there was an interesting point where people didn't think succession management was an issue. But actually, if you think about the wide skill set you've got there, actually getting people that even have half of those skills, let alone the full remit, it's going to be incredibly challenging.
And I think some of the CFOs that we interviewed took the view, it's my responsibility to grow the next generation. Because you look at that skill set, yes, you can put training to some of it, you can do learning activities, and rightly so, but some of it is actually learning by experience. And there's a quote in the report about the heir and the spare. I walk into organization, I take the view I want to create my heir, and if I possibly can, my spare as an alternative. And I've got to do that. And I think this is the fundamental thing of how do we grow that next generation of CFOs, is to recognize those that have that talent skill set. And they don't come from that traditional audit path that existed 20, 30 years ago. They now come out of finance business partners. And that goes back to your question, which I sort of haven't answered yet, I know, about are they qualified? I think the qualification is absolutely fundamental. But the reason you get that percentage that doesn't think it is because you've got to have all those other skills around it. And it's how do you do that? If you have a very, very strong second in the finance team, then you can get away with not having strong financial skills. And I think there are some organizations that sort of see that. But if you're going down that strategic path, I think increasing those finance qualifications are exceptionally relevant.
Yeah, and like you say, the heir and the spare is an interesting concept, because on the one hand, you need somebody that is financially capable to be able to lift off the burden of, like you say, the compliance and the reporting aspect. But that individual may not be the person that you would want to step up into your role should that opportunity arise. So it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? And there's almost that step change between sort of that FD or that financial controller role, and to whether one could be more financially focused and one, like you say, the heir of the spare. That's a brilliant piece of terminology. I love that.
But that also goes to the point, I think the quote we bring out in the report from a senior recruiter in a recruitment agency in Dublin, pointing out that for her, about 1 in 10 of the CVs that she gets across the desk, and this was sort of midway through the first wave of the pandemic. So this was when some organisations had shut themselves down, couldn't cope. The survivors were there. About 1 in 10 of those CVs fitted the job profile of what the CEOs were looking for in a CFO. And she said that's quite a disheartening statistic. So it is about how do we grow that skill set and how do we give that level of expertise to people to come through, because like anything, it's a continuous learning activity.
Yeah, and I think there's a few interesting points in that. I think the question is are people not being given the opportunities? Are they not able to, or aware that they have been given those opportunities and able to discuss it on a CV? Do you think it's that people aren't aware what businesses are looking for in a CFO, or do you think they're not being given or have the time to get involved in those more strategic elements?
I suspect it's a combination of both. And part of me says, and what the recruiter reflected on was, it's a question of that experience that if you have led and absolutely correctly led a finance team, you know, that core processing is absolutely right. You're absolutely spot on disclosures, all of that, those pieces, then you've done possibly what was expected of you. The problem is in this changing economic world and all the risks and shocks that we've got around us at the moment mean, yeah, forecast is going to be a necessity going forwards for quite some period of time. And none of this is static, it's all very dynamic. You've got to get used to thinking forwards, not reporting the past. And I think that's where that mindset change needs to come in, is how do you look to that? And you and I both know that's about having the data. That's about having the analytics power. That's about utilizing the systems. And again, in the mid tier, we know that there is a squeeze on investment in accounting tech, and ledger systems and big data aren't as embraced as perhaps one would hope they might be. So you've got a combination of factors, I think, there.
Yeah, I always find it really interesting that finance system, even though it's almost a core, is one of the last things that
Mm.
is thought about very often. So you'll see these amazing sales and marketing technology implementations within these it's mostly mid-size where I find it quite interesting, because I think the larger organizations, they know they
Mm.
need it, yeah, because of stakeholders, shareholders. But when you get some of those mid-size, it's quite interesting to see the wider business's view of the finance software and the importance of it. And actually, I've really noticed a change in that thinking, particularly with the pandemic, particularly from both the CFO, the FC, but also the wider board and the CEOs. Their perception of the importance of those systems and those processes is really changing. And I suspect it's aligned with that expectation around that CFO role.
I think you're entirely right. And that's actually quite pleasing to hear, because yeah, with my other reports hats on, that technology driver is absolutely fundamental to derive those insights. So if we go back to the headlines I gave at the start, 3 out of 4 of those stakeholder groups, insight, insight, insight. You can only derive insight if, as you correctly say, you've got that investment in the data, in the software. And increasingly, we've got to take a non-financial lens to this as well. We're not just now talking about reporting pure financial numbers. If you look at directives the EU are, for example, pushing out as drafts at the moment, the need to provide non-financial information up the supply chain is going to become important, and that covers your sustainability, your social, human capital. So the CFO increasingly is the guardian of the integrated reporting capitals in an organization, not just simply the guardian of the financial capital. And in another report, one of the really frightening things, and it's consistent, and this probably is about 2 years ago now, only about 18% of the respondents, mainly CFOs, thought human capital was anything to do with finance. And that of
Wow.
itself underlines this shift again. Rather interesting, 18% also thought financial capital was nothing to do with the CFO. Excuse me, which was worrying again too. But it is, I think, that broadening of organizations reporting performance in a different way, and the CFO being the guardian performance. And that takes us back to another one of our hypotheses, that wider performance view is absolutely essential for the role of the CFO. So it's then saying, actually, the stakeholder group I'm responsible to is a lot broader than purely the investment lens. There are many different capitals now with many different stakeholders.
And it is, I would actually echo that in the conversations that I have with a lot of CFOs and finance leaders, is around they're not just being asked for, like you say, financial information, standard P&Ls, balance sheets, cash flow. Actually, they're being asked to put that into context along with the operational metrics. So all of a sudden, they're being asked to pull data from different areas, to integrate those systems, to build this, this suite of information. And also they're also then added into that it needs to be dynamic, because the reporting needs of the business change. So I can totally understand that increased pressure, and I find it a bit like you, a bit worrying almost, that 2 years, was it 2 years ago, that report says that wasn't necessarily part of their remit, which is interesting, because I'm hearing it all the time.
And I think you can add something to that we're both sort of hinting at, that particularly for the mid-tier, the CFO increasingly is now the custodian of the data of the organization, whatever that data may be. We talk about data science, chief data officer, all of those sort of roles, but for the mid-tier particularly, the CFO is the CDO, together with probably the CHRO and a few other things. But that data lens is absolutely vital to what you just described as the multiple stakeholders and the multiple capitals through which you now need to think about your reporting. And those that provide funding are interested in the non-financial agenda as much as they are the financial now.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, isn't it? Is that they are that feed into the stakeholders. And do you think the reason that the CFO has that capability is because they're seen as that trusted individual within the organization? So
yes,
the understanding. Is there anything else driving it?
I think trust and integrity and ethics, absolutely. But it's also, I think, the view that we are naturally the group that, excluding the data science groups, understand data, understand accuracy, validity of data, the importance of internal control, to get that data to an appropriate percentage of accuracy. And it's the ability to communicate and tell that story in a way that has integrity and trust behind it, though that's the value. And that's not to decry the role of the CEO, for example, but the CFO is the person that's seen as the person with integrity that communicates to those stakeholders or those capital investors, whichever capital we're talking about. So I think it is strongly linked to our trust and ethics. And again, this goes back to the core of the qualification. As accountants, as finance professionals, we live by that ethical guideline that we sign up to in our studies, in our qualification. And that is fundamentally important to the role of the CFO.
No, I think that's a really interesting piece. And yes, that like you say, they're relied upon to not only produce the right numbers, but to interpret in a way that is ethical and trustworthy. And I think that's an interesting piece. So we talked a lot.
Sorry, I was going to say, and I think that's also why we're increasingly seeing that role of the virtual CFO, or let's use that term, the virtual CFO, coming into mid-tier and smaller organizations, because they can bring that lens. And it's not a question of them working full time. It might be 1 day a week or 2 days a week or on some strategic project. But that's why that skill set is so valuable. It's that trust that engenders, it's that confidence, it's that ability to get a handle on the data and the information and explain it in a way that those that need the confidence can gain from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting pieces, I think, is about how broad the CFO role is becoming in terms of other areas, because it doesn't feel like they're necessarily taking anything away; they're just adding more into the mix, which is expected. Do you think there's going to be a shift to, like in the CEO role, we have a CEO for the season for a particular type of, whether they're going on a growth trajectory, whether they're doing a recovery. Do you think we'll have that style of situation and placements for CFOs as well as CEOs?
I think we're seeing that certainly in the virtual CFO market. If you look at some of the organizations that provide that service, let me put it that way, you see CVs of potential candidates that are expressed in that level of experience or for that type of transaction or for that point in the business journey. So I think we're probably there in that marketplace. I suspect we're there also in the full-time marketplace. But then it comes back to, where do you get that experience that experience from? And I think for those virtual CFOs, they are people who have done it and have the track record and have chosen to use this as a path in their career journey. But we still need to make sure we're growing some of the people with those skills through the process. Otherwise, we become too reliant on a particular cadre of CFOs. So the question is, how do you create that learning pathway to get you to that CFO? How, if I am aspiring to be a CFO, what are the 2 or 3 things I need to do? Partly, I think it's get a breadth of operational experience. It's not just simply about pure financial experience. Secondly, I think it's about analytics and being able to tell the story and be able to communicate the story and understanding the future data, not just the historic data. And it is recognizing that, whatever label we want to use, the trusted business partner, the trusted advisor, the consultant, that skill set is absolutely fundamental. That interpersonal skill set is at the core of that CFO role as well. So gain experience in all of those areas to get you to that point. And it is interesting, you've looked at data in the report, industry expertise varies depending on which lens you're trying to look at. It's more important to some communities than others, and some CEOs don't value it as highly as perhaps you might think they would, and that of itself is interesting.
And why do you think it is certain industries that do value it? Was there what was the reason?
And I think there are always industries with specialisms, financial sector, transportation is an interesting one. There are so many nuances to knowing a CFO who contributed to the report in that sector. There are so many nuances that you really do have to know some of the particularities of that industry inside out. But there are others, as we talked about. If you're on the private equity track or whatever, then the skill set that becomes paramount is, can you get it to the next stage on that journey for the organization, rather than needing that industry specialism. So I think in part it's what you said earlier on about where you are on that business cycle and what skill set in CFO you're looking for.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting piece. I've heard it talked a lot about with CEOs, like what are we looking for that CEO to do? And I'm starting to hear a few more conversations about the same for CFO. So I just thought it was an interesting trend, and I'm sure it will continue, because the remit's so broad, I think, for that CFO role, that it's hard to find one person that can do everything brilliantly that's on that list. They are a unicorn in themselves, to be very fair.
That's a good statement.
So one of that may be the title of the next research, Finding the Unicorn. So one of the first slides on your report was about the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic has had on the CFO role. And we briefly talked about it last time, about the impact it's had on finance. But what surprised me was how varied the response was in terms of how people thought about the role, because there was no clear winner in terms of the degree of change that people were seeing. So yeah, what was your thoughts on that?
I think it's contextual, and probably in two different ways. Firstly, I think different industries and different geographies went through different experiences of the pandemic, and that's obviously going to impact what happened to the CFO and the organisation. But I think those that succeeded as organisations, again, back to something we've said, had the data, had the ability to forward model, had the ability to do what if, and to look at the potential consequences. Not that any particular scenario was ever going to come out 100% accurate. It's a question of what action could you take to help the business survive. So I think it's that side of it. I think it's also, again, that different level of experience of what a CFO could bring. And the CEO was probably demanding more and more of insight. How do we survive this? Where do we go? And yeah, we're back to processes, systems, and data, aren't we? Again, and the analysis and interpretation of that.
I think it's really interesting. The more of these conversations that I have, the more like the data systems and processes are kind of like the underpin that allow this exciting vision to happen. And it always becomes like the elephant in the room. I talk to a lot of CFOs, and they're saying, actually, I know where I need to go, but my problem is I'm still living in Excel at the moment, and we all know it. And so it's actually getting the momentum up to make that shift into that wonderful new role that we say is the direction of travel.
But if we can't get out of that box, I suppose, then I think you're right. The challenge is, how do we move forwards as organizations? How do we move forwards as finance teams? Because the danger is we'll get left behind. And I think that, back to something else we talked about those who didn't move forwards with the skills, it's easy to be left behind in this very dynamic world. And those organizations or those individuals that survive and thrive are going to be those that can be adaptive and learn and seek new insight. And that's driven by investment. And what you said earlier on about investment, particularly in the mid-tier and accounting systems, why it's absolutely fundamental. But you can understand they're very cash constrained, that it's not the easiest thing to invest in. And we have this conception that investing in accounting systems is big projects and takes a long time. And maybe that's a debate for another day. But yeah, that's the reality of it.
Yeah, I think one of the and I completely agree with you. There is this perception that it needs to be this massive 3-year project to drive and hit this implementation piece. And actually, the most successful teams that have made the shift are the most agile, in that they look at phases and staggered points, and they make small shifts, like stage shifts or leapfrogs, as I sometimes like to call it, to move themselves ahead. And then use that capacity creation that's happened to then drive further change. So you get this kind of snowball effect that starts to happen. And certainly the ones that we've worked with, they're the most successful, where people are very much have an agile view. Is like, we know roughly where we want to go, but we're just going to keep shifting forwards and reassess at each stage as to where our priorities need to lie in terms of, and not try and do too much at once.
But to that point, the CFO needs the vision to drive that forwards, don't they?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It comes, and it has to be driven. I always know successful projects because you have the CFO going, this is where we're going, guys, and I need you to help me get there. So it is absolutely critical. And I guess when we're talking about this opportunity, there is a major opportunity, isn't there, for finance? Because actually, finance is the obvious answer for this analytical role, this this ability to give the business visibility. And there is a danger that potentially if finance don't step up, that other areas will be asked to shift into and cover this gap.
Yeah. And there's a quote, I can't remember if we use it in the report, but one CEO who was a CFO in his history said exactly that. I will give my finance team chance to give me the data, but if they're not going to do it, I'll go and find somebody else that can. I'm not going to wait.
Yeah.
And that, I think, yes, it's part of the wake up call, but that's why, if this sense of the broader sense of capitals and the data that fits into across organizations, finance has to establish itself as the custodians in that sense. And it's not easy. And I suspect we're going to see a trend of bringing more and more of that non-financial related data into organizations, because we need to address more and more interest from various stakeholders. I mean, it's not just regulatory, across the capitals. And I think the finance team and the CFO at the top of the finance team needs to be in the position to have that data, to be able to tell that story, to take a wider view of performance, to look forward, to be the ultimate strategic advisor to the stakeholders and to the CFOs. Sorry, CEOs.
Yeah. No, and it's really heartening to hear that value that CFO and that strategic finance function brings is being driven as much from the CEO. Because I always find it's quite interesting when we're talking about systems and processes, about people focus on how much time things are going to save without talking about the value that it's going to bring to the business as a piece. So and for people to be able to, like you say, describe and communicate the value of a strategic finance function versus, just automation, which is kind of a side product. It's not the reason to drive the change.
And in another report, we've talked a lot about the concept of value when you appraise projects, and the sense that value is what we need to measure. And value isn't simply something that's financial. It's also something that is partially intangible, but particularly as we need to move organizations towards net zero compliance or towards a more socially equitable supply chain, some of those investments don't have quite the internal rate of return that we traditionally would associate with a large scale implementation, but they are necessities for organizations to move forwards. And that concept of value, and it links very much to this wider view of performance and what performance actually means these days, is fundamental. And the CFO, I think, embracing that and understanding that some of the traditional mantras that we had about investment, about benefit, etc., we need to reappraise as society itself has reappraised so much over the past 2 years.
Absolutely. We are living in a very different world. I can't believe it's only been 2 years of change. But it is incredible how much, business has shifted, how much personal lives have shifted in such a short space of time. So again, I think that whole concept of value is a brilliant. You keep doing this, Clive. You keep bringing up some great research right at the end of the podcast. So don't worry, listeners, I am going to plead and beg for Clive to come on and talk about value, because I think that's a really interesting topic and a thing that a lot of people that are looking at all sorts of implementations, not just finance systems, struggle to communicate, identify, and then present back to the relevant stakeholders. So it's one thing that we might have to chat offline about, Clive. I won't ask you to commit on air, don't worry. So thank you so much, Clive.
My pleasure.
It's been as it was last time, incredibly useful. So is there any sort of final top tips for both aspiring and existing CFOs that you think that key takeaways that they should think about in terms of this report?
I would hope the majority of them are on that journey. I think the key takeaways, potentially one, think about where that journey is going and the broader sense of performance and capitals across the organization, what that means. But I suspect a lot are getting on that journey. The plea, I think, is we need to think about how we bring the next generation forwards and give them the experiences. And we run the risk, I think, of organizations not having the talent pool that they need if we're not careful. So that's my message to them. My message to those aspiring is it's a wonderful thing to aspire to. But think about what we said in those three zones of experience in the business and finance business partnering, the broader view of performance and the interpersonal skills, the trusted skills, the communication skills that need to go with it, because all of that adds up to what a successful CFO is.
Absolutely. Some very wise words there, Clive. Some very wise words. So, for those of you listening that would like to actually read the report, we will pop the links as usual in the show notes, along with a summary, of course, of what we've talked about today. But I genuinely would suggest you read the report itself. It's incredibly useful. And the anecdotes that we've mentioned, obviously a lot of stats and a lot of information actually sits within that detailed report. And there is also a top level summary for those that don't want to go all the way through. There is some quick wins that can be had from having a look at that one. And for those that you that have enjoyed this podcast, please do remember to leave us a review or like and share the podcast. It is incredibly helpful to help us build out the audience. And I want to say a massive thank you again to Clive for joining us. It's been a pleasure, as it was before.
And my pleasure, Hannah. Thank you very much for inviting me.